course, nobody in the history of man had ever wielded the power that Stalin wielded. Tolstoy once said, 30 or 40 years before, imagine Genghis Khan with a telephone. And that really summed it up remarkably well.
By now, Bukharin was editor of Izvestia, the government newspaper. In a surprise move in 1936, Stalin sent him with Anna, then 8 months pregnant, to Paris, ostensibly to collect party archive.
A small footnote, but I think an interesting one, that in a play recently playing in Moscow, Bukharin and Stalin both appear, the actors playing them both appear, and Bukharin, so to speak, posthumously on stage complains he was shot in 1938, to which Stalin on stage says, but Nikolai, I let you go to Paris in 1936, why did you return? It's a nice question, why did he? I'm sure he knew what fate awaited him.
Nikolai
Ivanovich at that time just didn't have an inkling. No. I think he still wouldn't have believed. He would have returned just the same. Just the same. He wasn't like that. He would have returned just the same in order to have his say, to put his case. For example, he was in the Pamirs and went down by chance to the town of Frunze, and there he learned from the papers about Zinoviev's trial. And the day that the sentence was carried out, he sent a telegram to Stalin to postpone the carrying out of the sentence on Zinoviev in order to have a confrontation. He thought he could put Zinoviev's case in some way. Well, now we think in completely different terms. We think that they had some sort of idea. Of course they knew what Stalin was, but not to such an extent.
Nikolai Bukharin was arrested on the 27th of February 1937. He spent over a year in prison awaiting trial. During that time he was tortured and forced to confess to being a traitor and plotting to murder Lenin. Fitzroy Maclean was just 27 years old when he attended the trial on March the 3rd, 1938.
I sat listening to the speeches, taking notes, and in the intervals I did that 10 hours a day for 10 days. Very exhausting, especially as it went on to 2 or 3 in the morning quite often. In those days, Stalin liked staying up late, and he kept the whole country up late too. This is where that extraordinary trial was held. Before the revolution, it had been the ballroom of the Nobles Club. Now it was filled with a carefully selected audience of party members, come here to be thrilled, to be edified, but in the ultimate analysis, to be scared and to be warned. It was quite easy to recognize Bukharin. He looked, for one thing, much more of an intellectual than the others did. His intelligence shone out from his eyes. And then he had a palish complexion, and he had a little beard that made him look a little like his friend Lenin. There was also, of course, Rykov, who had been at one stage Lenin's successor. Then there was Kristinsky, who equally had been very important in the early days of the revolution, and who recently had been Deputy Commissar for Foreign Affairs, and who, you know, one had met at embassy parties and that sort of thing. Finally there was Yagoda, the enormously sinister former head of the secret police, who had probably mounted the whole trial himself, only to find himself popped into the dock along with the people he was accusing. At the beginning of the trial, of course, people were relaxed and waving to their friends and laughing and talking. But once it started, there was an atmosphere of pretty good tension, because after all, these men were being tried for their lives. One of the things that sticks in my memory is how fit and smart the special security guards looked guarding the dock, and how comparatively grey and seedy the prisoners looked. When the prisoners came in, there was a gasp of horror at the mere thought that such horrible people should exist. They were charged with every conceivable crime in the calendar, with having tried to murder Lenin, tried to overthrow the government, sabotage the economy, sabotaged agriculture, contacts with every secret service in the world, every foreign espionage organization, and so on, and crimes going right back to 1905, to long before the revolution.
The prosecution case was led by Andrei Vyshinsky. Later on, Stalin promoted him to foreign minister. A series of articles damning Vyshinsky's role in the trial were recently published by the Russian writer Arkady Vachsberg.
His method was abuse, bad language. When you read his speeches now, you are struck by the vocabulary of this professor who subsequently became an academic. He didn't take the trouble to construct a case. He paid little attention to evidence. But on the other hand, he had a good knowledge of the range of abusive language. His favorite expressions were filthy dogs, demented bitches, diseased lice, etc. It would be impossible to list them all now. The most remarkable thing is that this language got through. It worked. It made an impression instead of evidence.
Они готовят открыть фронт нашей страны. Они готовят открыть границы нашей страны. Они готовы открыть широко ворота иностранному завоевателю. Но они хотят изобразить это дело так, как будто это черное дело каких-то иных чужих рук, против которых они, видите ли, вот эти вот иезуиты и фарисеи, эти иуды Искариоты и Василий Шуйский поднимают теперь свой голос подлинного советского патриотизма. Игра разоблачена. Маска предательства с их облика, с их лиц сорвана. И сорвана раз и навсегда.
Vyshinsky was a particularly unpleasant phenomenon because his own political past, what everybody was digging into, wasn't too clear. He'd been a Menshevik until 2 or 3 years after the revolution. And that was not a healthy thing to have been. He also was second-rate in most ways, but a yes man through and through. And what was unpleasant, particularly unpleasant, was that he was obviously frightened himself. After all, amongst the prisoners was Yagoda, who 18 months or so before had been supremely powerful as head of the secret police. Now he was in the dock, and if he could be in the dock, Vyshinsky knew perfectly well that he could be in the dock too if he put a foot wrong.
Теперь, я думаю, ясно для всех, что нынешние вредители-диверсанты, каким бы флагом они ни маскировались, троцкистским или бухаринским, давно уже перестали быть политическим течением в рабочем движении, что они превратились в беспринципную и безидейную банду профессиональных вредителей, диверсантов, шпионов, убийц. Понятно, что этих господ придется громить и корчевать беспощадно.
Bukharin conducted himself with great dignity. He was, of course, immensely superior to anyone else there in character, moral character, intellect, and everything else. He had been one of the makers of the revolution, and he'd been a close friend of Lenin's, and he'd been a gold medalist at the university. He also knew the outside world in a way that people like Stalin didn't. And for all those reasons, in spite of his terrible predicament that he was in, and he knew perfectly well that he wouldn't come out of this alive, he did manage to dominate the proceedings in the most extraordinary way, rather to the discomfiture of Vyshinsky and the judges. The proceedings were filmed right through, as far as I remember. They had these up by the dock. They had these arc lights and movie cameras. And there was one extraordinary episode during the trial when the man, poor man who was operating the arc lights, let it get out of control. And it shot right up and through its beam of light onto that little middle window up there. And through the dark glass, we could recognize the features of Stalin gloating over his former colleagues. It was very dramatic indeed.
Bukharin at the trial did what he could. And if you read what he did try and say at the trial, one must bear in mind he had recently got married, he had a baby, both his widow and the then baby are still alive, and they wouldn't have been, I'm sure the point was made perfectly clear to him, if he didn't in fact plead guilty. But he started pleading guilty in a very peculiar way, and yes, of course, he was an enemy, but no, he didn't try and overthrow Lenin. There are certain accusations which he denied, and even the ones he admitted in such a way that, if you look at it carefully, I think he is telling the subsequent generations that one mustn't really believe it. Wyszynski, who was the prosecuting counsel, and, if I may say so, a bastard of the first water, was a little upset by the kind of answers he got. I mean, it's really a matter of somebody whose hands are bound behind his back. He's half-gagged, having to say something. In the circumstances, who are we to criticize what he did?
Well, he was sentenced to death as he was bound to be sentenced to death, and as he and everybody else knew before the trial began that he was bound to be. My own reaction was that was what was bound to happen in these circumstances. But of course what shocked me and what left really a horrendous impression was, after listening to this 10 hours a day for 10 days, one was stunned by it. One went away with the horror that it should be possible to manipulate human beings in that way, intelligent human beings, and get them to go through these antics.
By 1939, Stalin had personally signed 40,000 death warrants, eliminating men, women and children in an attempt to purge the country of the old Bolshevik revolutionaries.
What happened to me before his death, before the sentence? Yes, Nikolai Ivanovich was arrested on the 27th of February, and he had not yet been condemned when I was banished from Moscow to Astrakhan. A decision was sent there, allegedly sentencing me to 5 years' exile. But I was arrested again 3 months later. The wives of military men were also sent into exile there. In fact, we were exiled the very same day of the trial against Tukhachevsky, Yakir Ruborevich and others. And everyone was rearrested there and given 8 years in the camps. And I did my 8 years.
Anna spent a total of 20 years in camps. Separated from her baby, she did not see him again until he was 21. Stalin's reputation remained divorced from the terror until after his death in 1953. Such was his effect on ordinary people that no one realized what he had done.
Of course we didn't understand, because the Stalin cult was so strong, and he'd entered the people's flesh and blood to such an extent that, well, it was as if he'd become part of them, like a cancer growing inside the body. I had an 8-month-old daughter, and when I heard that Stalin was dead, I cried. I held her in my arms and I cried, because I was thinking, oh my God, she'll never see Stalin alive now. And I was sorry about that.
Literally just a few days before his arrest, and Bukharin still had a government network telephone. He was the editor of a major paper. He telephoned Stalin using the government network telephone and said, "Koba, do you really believe that I am an enemy?" And Stalin said to him, "Nikolai, calm down. We'll get to the bottom of things and everything will be okay." And he replaced the receiver. That is to say, he was a very great hypocrite. He was an actor writ large. He could present himself in one role during the Politburo sessions, in another in addressing the people, and in yet another when dealing with military commanders. He was an actor, and Bukharin was a victim of his.
Oh dear, he wrote him endless letters, proving his innocence and addressing him as Dear Koba. I don't know, but it's hard to say. But all the same, I think that he realized what he was worth. It's hard for me to say, because by then he was psychologically unbalanced. And I can't say that he was, by this time, a person in full command of his mind. Perhaps later, in prison, it all subsided. But here he was very agitated, and it was as though a straitjacket had been put on his brain. It's very difficult to explain psychologically. Very difficult. Because so much had landed on him. And on top of it all, a young wife and son who was virtually newborn. Well, he was 10 months old. And all of this together had a terrible effect on him. It's a difficult question, but I don't think he thought well of Stalin by then.
Anna's role in this story is fundamental, and its essence is that in the hours before his arrest in 1937, Bukharin wrote down and then subsequently destroyed a text dedicated to the future generation of party members. He insisted that she memorized it, which she did, and in 1961, herself having had almost a quarter of a century in Soviet prisons and labor camps, she was called in to a Khrushchev party commission investigating the Bukharin case and announced its existence.
I depart this life and bow my head. I feel my helplessness in the face of a hellish machine which, using no doubt the methods of the medieval ages, possesses gigantic force, fabricates organized slander, and operates boldly and confidently. I have been in the party since the age of 18, and the aim of my life has always been the struggle for the interests of the working class and the victory of socialism. During these days, the newspaper with the sacred name Pravda, Truth, has been printing the most vile lie. That supposedly I, Nikolai Bukharin, wanted to destroy the achievements of the October Revolution and restore capitalism. I appeal to all members of the party in these, possibly the last days of my life. And I am convinced that the filter of history will, sooner or later, inevitably cleanse the dirt from my head.